One mistake that I see a lot of people make is not tuning their detection settings. First, you want to hover over any detection component and press Q to open up the detection menu. The first thing you should always do is make sure you have the mainframe that you want selected. At the bottom, there's a slider that lets you slide through the different mainframes you have on your ship. You can look down here or right here to see the name of the mainframe if that helps you identify it. Once you have the correct mainframe selected, the first thing you want to do is change tracker mode from 2 per target to primary target. This one's better because you want your trackers to be focusing on the thing you're fighting and not anything else. Now this next part depends on what kind of weapons you have and what you plan on fighting. If you're using hit scan weapons, you want to set your speed averaging time to 0 and then your bearing and range averaging time to something really low, like 0.2. If you're using slow projectile weapons like Cram, you want to set a high speed averaging time. I would say anything over 1 second would be good. Higher values are more accurate, but at the cost of latency. You want to set your bearing and range averaging time kind of high as well. I'm going to set these to 1 second. It's perfectly okay to have even longer averaging time if you're using slow weapons like Crams. You can go up to something like 4 seconds on your speed, and 2 seconds on your bearing, and 2 seconds on your range, and I think it'll work just fine. If you're using slow projectile weapons like Crams and you fight an evasive enemy, there's not a lot you can do to hit them. I recommend just leaving your averaging time high like this so you're more effective against slow and not really evasive targets. Because Crams and other slow projectile weapons aren't really designed to fight anything evasive in this game. If you're using fast weapons like kinetic or plasma and you're shooting at 1500 meters per second or faster, then your settings will depend on what you'll be fighting. Now if you're fighting something quick and evasive, I recommend you set really low averaging time for all three. So for speed, I'm going to set 0.5, for bearing I'll set 0.2, and then range I'll set 0.2. These settings should help you land more shots on the more evasive targets, but keep in mind a lot of your shots might still miss depending on how evasive they are. If you're fighting something super small and extremely evasive, you have almost no hopes of hitting it with APS even if you have really fast projectile speed. If that's the case, I highly recommend you switch over to hit scan weapons like packs or lasers. If you're fighting something slow and non-evasive, then you want to set it to something like 1 second speed, half a second bearing, and then half a second range. This is good against enemies that aren't very evasive because the averaging time is high, so it gives you really accurate positioning. But they're not accelerating so much that you're going to have high latency and have your shots trail behind and miss. Now I'll show you how these detection settings impact your weapons. I have here 9 guns. Each of them are connected to different AIs, and every single AI has slightly different detection settings. So this first gun has 0 speed, bearing, and range averaging, and then they just gradually increase. And I think this gun here, I set it to the default settings that you would have if you don't touch detection settings at all. And now I'm going to show you just how much of a difference these detection settings can make. I'm going to start off by showing you the gun with the default detection settings. All the guns are shooting identical shells. I just have them shoot the sandblaster shell with a tracer. And I set different tracer colors to each shell so that we can differentiate which one came from which gun more easily. For this test, I'm going to be using the Tarpon, which is infamous for being kinda evasive and from the depths. Let me turn on God mode. With the default settings, every time the Tarpon accelerates, a lot of your shots end up missing. Notice how every single time the Tarpon changes directions, you can see a trail of shots going to where the Tarpon was and not where it's going. This is known as latency, and it's an issue with using the default settings and fighting something evasive. Because you're averaging the target's bearing, range, and speed over a long period of time, if the target suddenly changes directions, it can take a while to update the average, and that's the latency that you're seeing here in the video. Alright, let's get rid of it and check how many shots we actually hit. So we fired about 1,000 shots and we only hit about 43% of them. That means most of our shots missed. Now I'll go over some of the other detection settings. I'll start off with this gun, which has 0 averaging time for the speed, bearing, or range. And I'll show you just what it looks like when it fires. Once again, we're going to be using the tarpon. A lot of shots are missing because of the 0-second averaging time. This is because the gun is firing at the instantaneous position and velocity of the target. This is ideal for hit scan weapons because they don't have travel time, but it's really bad for projectile weapons because by the time the projectile reaches the target would likely have moved out of the way already. For evasive targets like this, you want a little bit of averaging time so that it'll shoot where the target will be, but not so much averaging time that there's latency, and whenever the target accelerates, it takes a long time to adjust to it. If you have a vehicle with a mix of hit scan and non-hit scan weapons, it's recommended that you put your hit scan weapons on a separate AI, and then tune that AI's detection separately. You might also want to consider doing it if you have a mix of really slow weapons like crams and really fast weapons like plasma, but it's not as necessary as with hit scan versus non-hit scan. Now that you've seen what no averaging and really high averaging time can do, here's a gun with averaging times for the speed, bearing, and range. A lot more shots are hitting the tarpon this time. There's some averaging, so whenever the velocity is staying constant, the shots can accurately hit it. Even when the tarpon accelerates in a different direction, there's low latency, so the aim quickly adjusts to it. Alright, let's check the accuracy. So this one hits 76% of its shot, which is 30% higher than the default averaging time. Now I'm going to show you all the guns with their different averaging time shooting together, just so you can visualize the impact that having different averaging times can make. I'll spawn the tarpon, and then we'll put it into God mode. And now I'll have all the guns fire. Here we can see the impact that different averaging times can have on your accuracy. Some of the shots, like the white ones, are trailing really far behind whenever the tarpon accelerates, and then some other shots are just missing a lot because they don't have an accurate reading. It's important to get a good averaging times for your particular target, otherwise you'll just end up missing a lot of shots that you would have hit if you properly set your detection. Alright, let's see how well each gun did. Alright, the first gun here with no averaging time only hit 14% of the shots. This one here with 0.1 seconds hit 51%. 0.2 seconds of averaging hit about 65% of the shots. 0.3 seconds hit 62%. 0.4 hit about 64 or 65% of the shots. 0.5 seconds hit 57%. 1 second hit 53. The default setting hit 31% of the shots. So the best settings for dealing with the tarpon is this gun, which has a 0.2 second averaging time. I spawned a tarpon and paused the game just so we can see the differences between the gun. So I had a breadboard print out where each mainframe thinks that the tarpon is, and that's the enemy position line. And below that, I had the mainframe print out what it thinks the enemy velocity is. Every single one of these mainframe thinks that the tarpon is either at a different position or has a different velocity and so it's going to try and lead the shot differently. And some of them will connect, and some of them will miss because of that. So some shots, like the green, the yellow, and the orange shots, they're fired at the correct position to hit the tarpon. And then we have some other shots, like the white and the red shots and the purple shots. It kind of lags behind because the higher averaging time gives it some latency when calculating where to shoot. For this last part of the video, I'm going to go over some of the data collecting that I've done. I tested different weapons with different projectile speeds, with different detection settings, and with different targets. So this here is my testing with a 1700 meters per second projectile. That's the sandblaster shell that you saw earlier. So I tested with a slow and non-evasive target like the crossbones, and I tested with a tarpon. I tried different detection settings, and then I selected the best results and then tried to tune my detection to figure out what would be the best against this particular target. So for example, with the crossbones, I tried these settings, and then I found that this one works the best. So then based off this one, I tried to tune the speed by using a bearing of 2.0, and then I found out that this performed the best. So I took the bearing and speed from this one and then tried to tune the range. And then this one did the best. And then I did one last tuning to try and figure out the best bearing by using the best speed and range here. And then in my last test, these two did the best. So the takeaway is, for slow and non-evasive targets like the crossbones and you're shooting fast projectiles, you want a high speed and range averaging time, something over 2 seconds, and moderate bearing averaging time, 1 second or less. And then I did the same thing with the tarpon. Of course, since it's evasive, it's significantly harder to hit. And then at the end, these detection settings did the best. So for fast evasive targets with fast shells, you want low averaging times for your bearing, speed, and range. So all of them should be 0.5 or less. Now don't worry about the accuracy seemingly going down past each tuning. That's because for each trial, we're comparing different detections to each other, not to previous trials. That's because, for example, in this trial, the tarpon might be more evasive than the previous one. So things should work out if we compare settings to each other within the same trials. Next up is the 1200 meters per second projectile. I would say this is medium-high projectile speed, but not super fast like earlier. I did the same kind of testing with the crossbones, and then at the end, this performed the best. So for slow, non-evasive targets with 1200 meters shell, you want moderate to low averaging time for everything, so 1.0 seconds or less. And then with the tarpon, I did the same thing. And this is the best results with a 33% hit rate. So for fast evasive targets with 1200 meters shell, you want low averaging time for your bearing, speed, and range, so 0.5 or less. Which is the same conclusion as in the previous test with the 1700 meters per second shell. And then lastly, I did some testing with the 800 meters per second projectile. For slow and non-evasive targets like the crossbones, you want moderate to high averaging time for everything, so 1.0 seconds or more. So these settings here technically did the best, but this one is a close runner-up. I would take these accuracy percentage with a grain of salt and not really try and use them to figure out the best settings, but to use them to figure out the ballpark of where your settings should be. And then for fun, I tested with the tarpon, and the accuracy rate on all settings were absolutely abysmal. The accuracy is so bad regardless of detection settings that it's just down to luck. The accuracy is so bad that it's pretty much down to random chance whether or not you're hit. But some of the lower detection settings did do better than the high ones. But you shouldn't really be using these slow weapons against evasive targets. This also shows the importance of having high projectile speeds. If we look at the crossbones with the 1700 meters per second projectile speed, we hit an average of 90% of the shots. If we reduce the projectile speed by 500, then we'll hit an average of 87% of the shots. And with 800, we're only hitting 74% of the shots on average. And this gets even worse when you're fighting evasive targets. With the tarpon and the 1700 meters per second projectile, we're hitting 45% of the shots on average. And then with 800 meters per second, we're missing pretty much every single shot. So just cutting our projectile speed in half is enough to make all of our shots miss versus something evasive. And that makes sense because halving the projectile speed means it takes twice as long for the projectile to reach the target, and that's twice as much time for the target to accelerate and move out of the way of the shot. I hope you found this video useful and you learned something from it. Thanks for watching.